Thank you for joining us today on Blessed Man Meditations, where we answer the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue Person of Interest, the J. Warner Wallace book, where we investigate why Jesus still matters in a world that rejects the Bible. Wallace is a Dateline-featured cold case homicide detective, popular national speaker, and best-selling author. Relying on over 2 decades of investigative experience, Wallace provides the tools needed to investigate the claims of Christianity and make a convincing case for the truth of the Christian worldview. He has a website, jwarnerwallace.com. Last time we did the introduction. This time we'll do Chapter 1, The Fuse and the Fallout, Jesus Without the New Testament. Begins with a quote by William Shakespeare, "Truth will come to sight, murder cannot be hid long," followed by a quote by Agatha Christie. "It's like all those quiet people, when they lose their tempers, they lose them with a vengeance." The fuse and the fallout will identify the felon. There's a picture from the book. There's the fuse in the middle. Person of interest refers to someone who's been identified and is involved in a criminal investigation but has not yet been arrested or formally charged with the crime. In criminal terms, it has no legal standing and can refer to either a potential suspect or someone who's cooperating with the investigation and may have helpful information. In the book, there's a narrative that Wallace repeatedly returns to about someone named Tammy. Tammy vanished. Her body was nowhere to be found. Steve was Tammy's husband. There was no crime scene. They suspected that something terrible had happened to cause Tammy's disappearance, but they couldn't pin anything on Steve right away. Disappearances like Tammy's don't typically happen out of the blue. Typically, there are hostile sequences of events that precipitate a disappearance like Tammy's. The hostile sequences of events make up the fuse that leads to the bomb going off that is the murder. The hostile sequences of events will include simmering anger and increased conflict. The suspect will have taken steps to cover his tracks prior to committing the crime. The steps taken by the suspect will be part of the fuse that points to him as the felon. The simmering anger and increased conflict will be parts of the fuse that identify the felon. After a bomb explodes, there is debris. The bomb is like the commission of a crime, and the perpetrator's life after the commission of the crime is the debris. Those life changes are the debris from the bomb explosion. The debris that the explosion leaves behind frequently point back to the felon. There's the debris. In the Steve and Tammy example, the debris was collected in the interviews the investigators did with people who knew Steve and Tammy. Less significant crimes need less preparation to be executed successfully. For example, it takes relatively little planning to steal a pack of gum from Walmart. In contrast, burglarizing a jewelry store requires a great deal more planning. Planning a successful murder is even harder. First, the evil desire needs to grow to the point that the murderous intent develops. Then the perpetrator must decide on a manner of death. Once the manner of death is decided upon, the weapons and materials must be obtained to carry out the plot. A foolproof alibi must be crafted. A more consequential crime will be precipitated by a longer fuse. A less consequential crime is easier to miss, and that type of crime involves less fallout. If someone steals your spare change from your car center console, you may notice after some days, or you may never notice. You may even conclude that you misplaced it or moved it rather than it having been stolen. However, you'd be much more likely to notice if the thief stole your entire car instead of just your spare change. If your entire car went missing, you'd involve the authorities. When a high-impact event like a car being stolen or a murder happens, it usually has effects that are felt after the crime gets committed. In such cases, it takes a while for the fuse to burn and the debris is difficult to miss. In the Steve and Tammy example, the fuse should reveal why the killer chose to murder the victim when he chose to do so. Why did the killer kill when he did? Why didn't he kill sooner? Why didn't he kill later? Steve was the person of interest in Tammy's disappearance. If Steve was responsible for Tammy's disappearance, the nature and timing of the fuse should match the growing anger, the intensifying pressure Steve may have experienced, and the unique deadline Steve faced. As a crime as tragic as murder has significant fallout. A murderer will work hard and be active to hide the victim's body after the murder has taken place. Beyond that, most people would expect the killer to misspeak, behave unusually, or otherwise inadvertently reveal their involvement. Each of the aforementioned behaviors are important aspects of the fallout. If investigated thoroughly, the fallout should also reveal the killer uniquely. Unless more than one person was involved in Tammy's disappearance, the evidence of the fallout should point uniquely to one suspect. So the parallel Wallace is making here is just with this Tammy Steve example. The extension can be made to the Jesus story, that there was a long fuse in that, namely the messianic expectation of the Jewish people, the prophecies that were coming along, that were written, that eventually pointed to the Messiah, that people knew that the prophecies pointed to the Messiah, and then Jesus went and fulfilled them precisely and specifically. And then in the fallout, you have things like the birth of the church and the persecution that came to the early church and continues in the present day church. And there's a lot of parallels that are drawn. So if Steve committed this crime with the murder of Tammy, the debris in the fallout should implicate Steve and no one else as our person of interest. And so if Jesus is the Messiah, the debris from his coming and the fallout should implicate him as the person of interest, the Messiah that the Bible describes him as. It's important to remain open-minded and watchful when investigating evidence in the fallout. Some fallout evidence occurs immediately after a crime occurs. Other forms of evidence take years to develop. So immediately after Jesus rose, there was an empty tomb. Immediately after Jesus rose, there were appearances. There was preaching about a risen Savior. The New Testament was written within a couple of decades, several decades after the events took place. Other forms of evidence take years to develop. You find archaeological findings that are still coming in that corroborate the New Testament and the Old Testament. So here's what we're talking about as it relates to the Gospels. If Steve killed Tammy, virtually every aspect of Steve's world may eventually be affected: his romantic relationships, the way he parents his kids, the topics he discusses with his friends, the kinds of movies he prefers, where he lives, how much alcohol he drinks. All these areas of Steve's life can provide us with data that help us determine if Steve was responsible for Tammy's disappearance. So Jesus was the prophetic explosion, the messianic explosion that turned the whole world upside down. The pastor who spoke at the church service that Wallace and his wife Susie attended earlier in the book said Jesus was the smartest man that ever lived. The teaching of Jesus transformed the world because Jesus was God incarnate. Jesus, who was God, became a man. If that pastor was correct, Jesus' explosive appearance would denmark the pivotal point of history. Even as an atheist, J. Warner Wallace recognized that Jesus' birth divided the calendar before the common era from common era. Something about Jesus initiated a new historical epoch. His Jesus' appearance was the explosion that broke the human timeline into two eras. This explosion, when Jesus came on the scene, like an explosive event that precipitates a murder, was preceded by a fuse and created its own fallout. Just like in a murder case, one can determine if Jesus is history's unique person of interest if you examine the events leading up to Jesus' first coming and the events following Jesus' first coming, even without having to refer to the New Testament. If Jesus was who Christians claim that he is, one would expect the fuse to be long. Impactful events, after all, typically have longer fuses. The events building towards Jesus' appearance should span centuries if he was the person the pastor described that Wallace heard on that fateful day. One should also expect the fuse to act as a timer. If Jesus was something more than human, was the timing of his appearance significant? For what reason did he not arrive centuries earlier or decades later? What historic deadline had to be met by his arrival? The fuse would reveal the answer. If the pastor was right about Jesus, one should also expect significant fallout after Jesus' earthly life and teaching. Jesus clearly affected our calendar, but if Jesus was the divine person of interest described by the pastor to which Wallace refers, one would expect considerable ripple effects beyond the demarking of time. And we're going to go through person of interest, and we're going to see a ton of ripple effects. In addition, the evidence of the fallout would point uniquely to Jesus as the cause of transformation. In fact, one would expect to identify Jesus specifically and reconstruct the details of his life robustly from nothing more than the debris, even without descriptions offered on the pages of Christian scripture. And that's what person of interest uniquely does. There are a lot of apologetic books out there, but person of interest has to do with recreating the life of Jesus outside the New Testament. The debris on this side of the explosion would describe Jesus in an unmistakable way. Finally, if Jesus was truly the smartest, most transformative, and most influential man in history, one would expect the fallout to affect diverse aspects of our world. Jesus was more than a mere human. One would expect the appearance and teaching of Jesus to change nearly every aspect of the world, and one should find evidence of this impact in unexpected places. And you do find it in unexpected places, and Wallace will show that. Wallace had been studying for hours, and his wife Susie noticed the sunrise before Wallace did. Prior to that first day at church, Wallace had a very different morning routine, but everything changed for Wallace when he started investigating the fuse and fallout related to Jesus. Now, Wallace poured nearly as many hours into investigating Jesus off-duty as he spent investigating notorious criminals on duty. Over the next several months, Wallace developed a timeline for Jesus in much the same way he develops a timeline for all his no-body homicide cases. As the event and revelations found their place on one side of the Jesus explosion or the other, Wallace's presuppositions and doubts about Jesus were challenged and eventually vanquished. Now that we understand the way Wallace investigates, Wallace will examine the evidence with us and will share his startling findings with us. As the fuse and fallout take shape, Wallace will show us why Jesus still matters, even if one rejects the Bible. Wallace will show that Jesus is more than merely just a person of interest. That is the end of Chapter 1 in Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. Next time is Chapter 2, Jesus, the Average Ancient, where we will examine the cultural fuse. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.